Oh, you've got John Englander's book. Very good. Now,
Just
John,
came in today.
Yeah. So John, what are we doing today?
Well, I think we're pursuing the line that I suggested, which we could do, which is to see how we could write letters to people like the Treasury in the US and influence the policy decisions of governments like the US through that means.
I'm afraid, I fear you find that they've got plenty of people paid to deflect this kind of incoming stuff to save them wasting time reading it. There'll be lots and lots of people whose job it is to deflect this.
Well, Doug, did you get that impression when you tried?
So I sent the letter to Janet Yellen, and I've been trying to get through to Bernie Sanders, whose policy advisor committed to me that she would speak with John Kerry's staff once he gets them assembled. And last week I got an automatic reply in response to an email I sent her, when can we talk, that she had left Bernie Sanders' office. So I've called twice now to talk with her sidekick, and I'm waiting for a call back to talk with their chief of staff. But the message I left was simply, I have a very important message from this collective body for Bernie Sanders to pass on to John Kerry. And if she decides not to respond to that, we're SOL. But if she does respond, then there's a chance we could get the message to John Kerry.
Except that he's surrounded by similar people.
Well, okay, so we don't do it. Just give up?
Try.
You're saying don't go to John Kerry? I mean, why not try?
You might, he might do it, but.
So what alternatives do you have, Stephen?
The trouble is there's lots and lots of other people who are writing to them, and a lot of them will be nutcases. And there's a lot of effort in trying to save him wasting time reading from the nutcases. And
but if Bernie Sanders approaches John Kerry or Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, think about that.
Yeah, he'll get through, but he's also surrounded.
Should I just leave the conversation now?
You just have to try, but don't hope for too much.
One thing that was said at the HCA meeting on Saturday was that some experience from, I think it was Clive on the call, or was it Mark? No, it was Mark on the call, said that he'd tried a telephone campaign for selling some idea or other. And he said that the mean time to get a response was 5 calls. So you just do have to persist. And it seems to me if we can do a bit of the hard and the soft sell kind of duo idea. That's I tried that for Doug. So he sent a kind of hard letter, and then I sent a soft wet letter or something like that.
One too much.
To support Doug. So I think if others of you could rally around and send letters saying basically the same kind of thing, perhaps putting it in different ways, stressing different aspects, they might realize that this is important, and I'm not just a single person who's a bit crazy.
I agree with Stephen in a way that Yeller probably has a lot I mean, if a Vaz is marshaling hundreds of thousands of letters, then it's going to get lost in an avalanche. So I agree that just sending a letter to Yellen may not get through, but somebody might see it. Whatever staff might see it.
Well, we got through to Sir David King, and I was scheduled a half an hour telephone call, so I had to make most of it, but it was enough for him to agree to have a meeting, and then we had several meetings, including Stephen Salter in them and Peter Wadhams. So it is possible to get through to some people. Now that was at a time when Sir David King was still quite influential. I think he's become much less influential recently. I think the latest scientific advisor about balance is very tame in comparison. So the UK is not a very good position from point of view of scientific advisors, but they do have a strong treasury, and they did have a very strong man, Mark Carney, as the Chancellor of the Bank of England, manager, what is the head of the Bank of England, and he's taken quite seriously on getting companies to reduce their carbon footprint and commit to a low carbon future. So, you know, there is hope that we can get through. I mean, if we don't manage, who is going to change the direction? Are we just going to allow the people who say that emission reductions to zero is the answer to climate change? Or are we going to let them carry on and ruin our future for us all?
No, I'd like to, it strikes me, I got on a few minutes late, but I'm assuming you're talking about some kind of letter or an attempt to get a meeting with Kerry or others influential. I live, some of you may know, I live right in the DC, Maryland area, and my congressman is Jamie Raskin, who those of you who are American certainly would know him from the impeachment and his tragedy, his personal tragedy of losing his son just before that to suicide. But a couple of interesting points. Number one, he's probably amongst the 5% most progressive liberal Congress people around. Number two, he was the one who introduced the resolution 2 years ago for climate restoration, the only congressman to do that. And I think it was, Peter, I guess, Filkowski and others probably, I don't remember who was directly connected to him and introduced that. So he certainly has at least a familiarity with it. I've had a couple of meetings with him. I introduced him at a webinar just after the election and praised him for the climate restoration resolution, which I think sort of startled him when I looked at his expression because it doesn't get a lot of attention. But what's interesting, and I hadn't thought about this before, and I'm annoyed that I hadn't, his wife was on the Federal Reserve, and she was recently appointed as Janet Yellen's climate advisor. So if we can get to the Raskins, and I can certainly, if not myself, I know enough people here who are close with him or closer with him, I would, be delighted to see if we could, get the two of them on the same page, or at least to hear us. But I think it's, it's important to get the most obviously compelling and, in brief and compelling and backed up by as much science and authoritative information as we can, so that he takes it as seriously as possible, and his wife as well. So anyway, just throw that out wherever that may or may not fit. I'd be happy to do what I can at the right time with the right vehicle.
Okay, well, we can certainly send you our various messages that we've sent already, and then we could work on a hopefully an even stronger message, which would kind of hit some buttons. I think we need to think about the people we're writing to and what will make them sit up and listen rather than throw the thing into the wastepaper basket. So can we do that, Herb?
Yeah, you remember a couple of months ago I'd suggested, and I don't, the idea of putting together some kind of more formal white paper.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's progressing, but and not that I'm looking to delay anything, but the more powerful and footnoted and compelling an argument in writing to back up whatever is said verbally, I think would maybe worth maybe worth a little delay. I don't know. Again, I leave that up to you.
Yeah, I thought about the white paper, and it can get quite complicated. I wrote some notes to you in the prelude to this meeting. Robert replied to some of those. These are kind of common misconceptions, but that could be the basis of a white paper. One could have small chapters on various headings and go into the things that are wrong or being misrepresented by IPCC scientists, because basically it's the scientists are misleading the public into thinking that emissions reduction will save the planet, and there's even a program which the introduction is 40 ways to save the planet, and it's all to do with emissions reduction.
Yeah.
So there's a huge hold by these scientists on the general public, and we have to break that, because that will lead us to catastrophe of probably several kinds simultaneously, or one after the other. I mean, sea level rise is bound to happen on our current course. Catastrophic sea level rise is bound to happen. I mean, even more than John Englander says it will. And there's almost guaranteed to be the climate will change even more than it has already, and it's already pretty catastrophic for some people. And then there's the methane, which would just blow the lid off global warming and send us into a hot house state. So the possibility we go into the opposite. If the Greenland ice sheet collapses, it could turn off the AMOC, and then we could be the start of another ice age. But that's hopefully will act before that we get to that stage and stabilize the Greenland ice sheet, and which will slow down the sea level rise to an acceptable level. We're going to stop the methane as well.
Now, my thoughts on these questions is that writing to politicians at this point is fairly pointless. I think that's, and rather than a white paper, my view is that what is needed is extended coverage in influential magazines, and so I'm thinking like the Atlantic or the New Yorker as places that that should be able to engage in the conversation about, to what extent can emission reduction stabilise the climate, and they really haven't engaged conversation properly, and so without that sort of a public conversation at the sort of general intellectual level, I don't think that there's any possibility of shifting the views of politicians. Now, I think just before we continue with that, I'd just like to welcome Evan Hughes, who I haven't met Evan before, and I've met everybody else who's on the call, and I'd just like to give Evan an opportunity to introduce himself. I'd like to take yourself off mute, Evan.
Yes. I've been on the Saturday call that Peter Fikowski, I think, originally organized. And I've met John Nissen and Andrew Bailey and Peter Wadhams through that. I'm a physicist by academic training, PhD at Caltech, but most of my career has been in contract research related to energy and the environment. The long part of it was at Electric Power Research Institute, EPRI, in Palo Alto, here where I live. And there I worked on geothermal energy and biomass energy. My actions these days are through a climate action group at my local Presbyterian church, and also through Citizens Climate Lobby, and in some association with 350 Silicon Valley.
Great, thank you very much for joining us, Evan. Now, just before continuing our conversation, I'd just like to just open the floor to anyone in terms of what we'd like to discuss today. So we've got some great people here. I'm just looking especially at Peter Wadhams and Ronal Larsen in terms of whether you have comments to make at this point.
Well, the only thing I had to suggest was that in the prelude to this meeting and material that John sent today, he identified something which I've been thinking about but hasn't been solved, and it might be something which is the concern about Arctic amplification and what causes it, because we know that there is this large amplification factor, about 3 times, but the sort of conventional, which you might call sort of lazy view of what causes it is that because the sea ice is retreating and snow on land is retreating, that gives the world a lower albedo on average, and that gives us enhanced warming, and that's the cause of enhanced Arctic amplification to warming. But the trouble is that that has been happening. The evidence of enhanced warming in the Arctic goes back right to last century meaning the 19th century, if you look at the data. And yet the retreat of sea ice, which is supposedly the cause of all this, didn't really start until 1950 or so. So Arctic amplification has been a permanent aspect of the Arctic, so that once the world starts warming, the Arctic will warm 3 times as fast. Why is that? And we need to know, because that's what's causing enhanced sea level rise. It's what's causing a lot of the problems with climate feedbacks, and yet we really don't know why this amplification is happening, and that there is some intrinsic property of the Arctic atmosphere or something that is causing that. So John drew attention to that, and I think that might be something we could discuss, because unless we can solve what's causing Arctic amplification, we're bound to suffer from it. And if we find a way to cool the Arctic in some way, then with amplification, the cooling will be greater. So we need to know what's going on the Arctic amplification front, and we don't really know it properly. So I think it was good that John drew attention to that, and it might be something we can discuss. I mean, I don't know the answer, but I wonder if anybody else does.
But if you don't know, Peter, then no one will.
Well,
so
that's what I fear.
So I mean, so the question there is whether the need is for basic field research or for bringing together theoretical information, and I suppose also the modelling of like if the amplification is accelerated, then similarly the cooling effects of a reversal of cooling the Arctic would have a knock-on effect around the planet, and so like those are fairly simple concepts. But Stephen Salter, yes.
One of the things that would fit very well, since of the time scale that Peter mentioned, would be the wear from motorcar tires. If that's being deposited over the snow, it's making it darker, and along with soot and stuff like that. There was probably a lot more soot earlier on. There's maybe less soot now, but the tire wear is a very good way of absorbing solar energy. So we could look into that.
Like carbon.
Yes, I mean, I think that's certainly an experimental field that is in need of really careful attention. I mean, black carbon, we know hopefully we'll be getting some this year, because we're going to be going up to Greenland ice sheet and doing some work up there on it. But it ought to be pretty straightforward to just take a load of samples of black carbon and see what it is, because some of it could be that tires, some of it could be simply dust, some of it could be soot from brush fires in various parts of North America. We need to know, because we need to know how fast this blackening is happening. But I suspect that still doesn't answer the question of what could be causing acceleration of warming in the past, at a time when or not necessarily before the Industrial Revolution, but before the 20th century, when there was no detectable retreat of sea ice going on, and yet the Arctic was still warming faster than any other part of the world. Something was happening there.
Peter, you sent me some graphs, and you commented that Arctic amplification was occurring all through the last century. So there was a war at the initially there was some global warming, and the Arctic warmed even faster. And then there was some cooling, global cooling, from between 1940 and 1970, and the Arctic cooled even faster.
Yes, everything the Arctic does, it faster than any other part of the world.
Now, this is good news in the sense, if we can lower the global temperature, the Arctic temperature will lower, and so the effect of that is to reduce the gradient between the Arctic and the rest of the planet. So we could solve the Arctic problem by global cooling through this mechanism. It doesn't matter how the mechanism works. But so rather than try to cool the Arctic directly, which is what I was suggesting, we could. This suggests that we could safely apply global cooling, and it would do what we wanted for the Arctic. So I think that's potentially very good news.
Yeah, it's. I wish I knew how it happens, though.
That isn't a plausible mechanism, Peter, that the greenhouse effect started to kick in the 19th century with the burning of coal in Europe, and that greenhouse effect directly caused currents to warm, which flow into the Arctic, and so that very minor warming of water flowing into the pole, flowing under the pole, would have been sufficient to generate a measurable warming of the pole.
Yes, that could be it. I mean, and the sort of explanations that don't require kind of modern intervention revolve around, a lot of them revolve around the fact that the troposphere in the Arctic is thinner than in other parts of the planet. So when you actually heat the Arctic at a low level in the atmosphere, you're not having to heat as much atmosphere as you do if you're warming the mid latitudes. But then why is that happens? We don't know. But it would be good to know, just because then we can see what it is we'd have to do to try to bring down the temperature of the Arctic in some significant way. At the moment, this is being identified as a big deal, and I'm not sure quite why. But if you look at the Cambridge Carbon Repair Manifesto that David King brought out, there are three objectives in it. One is reduction of emissions to some low level, and the second one is removal of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and the third one is cooling the Arctic, or refreezing the Arctic to bring back sea ice and bring back take away the tendency of the methane to bubble out of the Arctic. And these are given kind of equal weight in their manifesto. But the one about cooling the Arctic to get rid of sea ice or bring back sea ice is an odd man out in a way, because it's being proposed independent of what else you do. It's sort of independent of what you can do to bring down warming by reducing emissions or by removing CO2. It's saying, well, let's do something specific to the ice to bring it back, and do some kind of engineering thing to the ice. First of all, the question is, how do you do that? And of all the sort of wild and wonderful methods that have been proposed, I can't really see one that will work well, except maybe marine cloud brightening targeted. That might advance the ice a bit. And the other one is this question of whether iron salt aerosol can do something to reduce the warming of the planet, as opposed to simply removing methane. But there's a real question which they identified as, we must solve this, and it doesn't matter if we haven't solved global warming, so long as we can solve disappearance of ice. And so other people besides ourselves have identified that as an urgent problem, but of course haven't come up with an answer.
And
Peter, is there a reason why the troposphere is thinner in the Arctic? Has it always been that way? You know, or has it become thinner? Is it?
Well, I don't know. It's simply a result that's quoted by meteorologists. Maybe it's simply an experimental observation, or it may be something to do with the dynamics of a rotating body that the lower layer atmosphere is. Yeah,
centripetal force. Okay.
Yes, yeah, just that. It could be that.
And it seems that the climate repair use of refreezing the Arctic is, in a sense, a proxy for broader solar radiation management, just in a context where advocacy for a focus on albedo as a climate response generates quite furious political opposition, and so finding a way into a discussion of albedo more broadly that's more acceptable is to just talk about the albedo of the pole rather than the planet as a whole.
Yes, that could be the case. I mean, I think they are very aware of what's going on at the moment with this opposition to anything that smacks of geoengineering. Seems to be now a no-no. That's, I don't know why that's developed, and it seems to develop quite fast. Maybe because of ideas about putting a lot of aerosols in the upper atmosphere, but things like marine cloud brightening ought to be regarded as harmless completely, because they are just putting in something into the atmosphere at low level. There's the thing you're putting into the atmosphere is water, and there's nothing more harmless than water. And you can control and target what you're doing and stop it instantly if it doesn't look good. So I can't see why there should be a single objection by anybody to marine cloud brightening, and yet that seems to be attracting opprobrium along with putting aerosols in the stratosphere. There's something.
It's a strategic question, Peter. It's because people like Michael Mann and Bill McKibben have a strategic view of climate change as requiring a war, and so it's a war against fossil fuels. And so that anything that gives succor to the enemy is considered to be treason. And so geoengineering is seen as slowing the timescale required for transition to zero carbon, and therefore is viewed as treason. And so when you have that sort of political analysis of that you're effectively working with the Nazis, to use the sort of Second World War analogy, then the emotion that sort of thinking generates is sufficient to eliminate any sort of dispassionate scientific analysis. So I think, I'd just be really interested to talk with journalists about that sort of strategic psychology, and so how the sort of unconscious motivations are playing into the politics, and so why somebody like yourself sees the opposition as incomprehensible, and why there isn't the ability to engage in measured dialogue about these questions. They're simply so. I think opening up with people like Michael Mann and Bill McKibben, and we see it in Australia with our Climate Council, where always the drumbeat is we must accelerate the cutting of emissions. And, regardless of whether there are other methods of reducing radiative forcing that are more efficient and effective. Now that was Ronal, but yeah. So anyway, it's putting it into that sort of a strategic political context seems to me the most important thing, and being able to get that sort of a conversation happening somewhere in the public.
Yes, I mean it extends in a weird way to a differentiation between marine marine radiation management or radiation management and carbon dioxide removal. I mean, it's sort of bizarrely that way, like IPCC with their how do we avoid warming beyond 1.5. It's, well, we've got to be tremendously efficient in reducing our carbon emissions, but we have to be so tremendously efficient it's beyond the realm of human possibility. But we also, if we by chance go beyond 1.5, which of course we will very quickly, then you're entitled to use a bit of carbon dioxide removal, air capture or something, but you're not entitled to use any geoengineering technique. And this was absolutely spelled out by the head of the IPCC, who gave a lecture about this when that report came out. I mean, I talked to him and he said, well, we are not allowing geoengineering to be used. And I said, why? But he didn't answer that. But it's at other places they've said it's because if you can use geoengineering, then that gives you an excuse to keep driving SUVs and use fossil fuels galore, because the geoengineering will prevent the air temperature from warming up and doing you in. So you must be punished for using fossil fuels by having yourself done in by the enormous rapid temperature rise. It's a punishment, which seems to me to be totally daft, but that's the way they would view it. It's an excuse. They think that both CO2 removal and radiation management gives mankind an excuse for continuing to live in a profligate way, but that's something for which we ought to be punished, and we mustn't escape that punishment. It's a kind of a very sort of puritanical view that, but I mean, to a normal person would say, hey, if we can find a way to get rid of CO2 so that we don't have to all live in the Stone Age, then that's good. But the IPCC would say it's better that you learn how to live in the Stone Age rather than that we make life easy for you by getting rid of your CO2.
It's very clear that the broad electorate votes against anything that it looks to be a cut in standard of living, and so the ability to get this sort of puritanical thinking implemented in political terms is really quite minimal. So it's really a strategy that's quite unworkable, because it's quite anti-democratic, and so I would have thought that that slowing the required transition pace to renewables was a good thing. Sort of taking off the pressure for renewables to do all of the heavy lifting for planetary cooling. Finding other ways that can do that heavy lifting, so that then so that we don't have to distort the economy by unnecessarily speeding up the pace of renewables. So Evans asked David Keith and urgent research needs. I'm looking for Link. Do you want to speak about that, Evan?
Yes, I've read an argument by David Keith that there's really a need for a lot of R&D done urgently, so that to investigate some of the kind of topics that have come up here, because when the world finally starts putting in the emphasis and the action, it's best if you already have investigated what to do in some of these very questions that came up here, and to research on the effectiveness of them and try to base the decisions to act on better information and knowledge than we have now. I don't know to what extent he's identified specific topics that he thinks fit into this need. And I don't particular, I haven't noticed the Arctic being one, but I probably haven't given it enough attention. I had a thought also on the Arctic.
I was just going to say that perhaps we should invite David Keith to join our discussion.
I think that would be great, because some of the questions are so between stratospheric aerosol injection, marine cloud brightening, and directly refreezing the pole, they seem to be the big three albedo potential activities, and just getting a sense of what the scientific views around the balance between those should be. And then also getting like a conversation with David about the political constraints to his work at Harvard would be, I would certainly find fascinating.
There are some questions about SO2 and what it's done. So if the planet actually cooled between 1940 and 1970, was that because of extra SO2 in the atmosphere?
Well, yeah, the models that, of course, I tend not to believe models very much, but the model that's accepted is that between 1940 and 1960 70, there was an increase in particulates in the atmosphere because the big industrialization that was happening just before the war produced huge numbers of coal-fired power stations all over the place. That was, coal-fired power stations were the in thing. And so you find countries like Poland absolutely crawling with coal-fired power stations. And those were producing particulates. And the particulates were actually cooling the atmosphere because of the being of a size, particles were of a size that had a cooling effect.
So you've got the aerosol cooling effects in the mainly in the troposphere. So they did the kind of marine cloud brightening effect and various other effects.
Mainly things like in Britain just after the Second World War, you had these incredible smogs in London killing thousands of people each time, and that particulates trapped in the fog, in water droplets in fog, and doing actual mayhem to people's lungs, but also reflecting radiation and cooling the atmosphere. So but there was a battle.
It was certainly quite cold underneath the smog, because the sun was being reflected away back into space. So that could that could easily be an example of how aerosol cooling could work. And so what we need to do is to repeat that, only more sensibly. So we do things that don't get in the lungs. We stick the sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere rather than into the troposphere. Is one thing.
It comes down eventually.
Yeah. We've discussed that quite a lot, and there is a case for injecting north of about 60 degrees north, where it doesn't come. It comes down fairly quickly.
Everything gets everywhere.
Away. That's not true.
It is.
Doug McMartin is doing, and David Keith and some other people have been doing some modelling, which shows that SO2 cooling in the stratosphere is quite effective, and you can avoid a heating effect in the winter because the aerosol doesn't last for more than a few months, and you can do it such that it doesn't affect the ozone hole, which is the big worry with large volcanoes, is that they promote the reactions that produce the ozone hole, because they react with the CH Cs or whatever they are, the chloro or bromo compounds, which were refrigerants, used as refrigerants. So there wasn't an ozone hole until we came along and put those fluorocarbons up into the into the stratosphere, or they percolated up and caused this reaction with the SO2. So Pinatubo did aggravate the ozone hole. But this can be avoided if we inject at high latitude. If we inject at the equator, then the circulation of the Brewer-Dobson circulation has the effect of taking the air high up and up towards the pole before it comes down again. So it's like a Hadley cell, like a single Hadley cell. Instead of having 3 Hadley cells between the equator and the pole, we just have one, which is the air is moving steadily northwards. So air enters from the troposphere into the stratosphere around the equator, and it leaves further north.
An underlying issue here is how, and this is discussed somewhat in a paper I wrote this year with Ronal director and others, that the cooling effect of aerosols from coal is just a key issue, and so those aerosols, if you're going to get rid of coal, then you need to replace those aerosols, because as well as the warming effect of coal, you're cutting out the cooling effect of coal, and so it's essential that people who are focused on emission reduction accept that by ending fossil fuel use, they're also ending the cooling effects of fossil fuels as well as the warming effects, and so finding the most efficient way to replace those effects, whether that's by iron salt aerosol or any other form of aerosol, is just an essential thing. But I just haven't really seen that observation engaged in among advocates of emission reduction.
No, it's you get kind of compartmentalized thinking there, because in the 50s and when we went from this temporary cooling back to full-scale warming, it was because the atmosphere was being cleaned up. It was because all the filthy factories and power stations that were emitting coal-fired soot from coal-fired boilers and heating systems, that was having this effect of killing people, as it did in Britain. And the response was, let's have a Clean Air Act, forbid all these factories from emitting all this stuff, and forbid people from burning coal and in their homes, and have a Clean Air Act, which Britain did and lots of other countries did. And the more Clean Air Acts you have, the less particulates you have in the atmosphere, and the more rapidly global warming progresses. So by cleaning up the atmosphere, we've taken ourselves back into rapid climate warming. And the country that's doing that now is China. I mean, they have had disgusting coal-fired power stations, and people have been choking to death on the streets of Beijing. And they suddenly realized, well, we mustn't do that. Let's clean up the atmosphere. And so they're producing all kinds of clean air regulations and removal of coal-fired power. And yet, the more they do on that, the more they accelerate global warming. So there's you either choke to death or you roast to death, and there doesn't seem to be anything in between, but there must be, and we have to find it. But at the moment, we're by making ourselves cleaner world, we're not actually making ourselves better. We're making ourselves actually hotter.
India has also had extraordinary pollution. So, as India and China gradually come to grips with just cutting pollution for health and environmental grounds, as you say, there's this side effect of causing warming. Although the black carbon has both a warming and a cooling effect. So, when black carbon falls on the snow, it cuts albedo, but it's the stratospheric effect of black carbon that causes cooling.
Yes, when the black carbon's lying around, like forming some great thick layer over the Greenland ice sheet, then it is actually warming the planet. It's when it's in the atmosphere that it's cooling it. So you don't have an escape route. Actually, it seems the whole system is designed to make life as difficult as possible for the human race.
John, you mentioned the chlorofluorocarbons. Paul Hawkins, in his book, rates that as the #1 offender, of course. So it's in a discussion with France Osti a couple of years ago. Afterwards, got in touch with Paul Hawkins and said, "Well, look, ISA can actually destroy the chlorofluorocarbons, and as one of the benefits." And Paul came back and said, "That's amazing. That's because it is a massive. It's like 3,000 times worse than CO2. So it's on
a unit level, but the volume is tiny by comparison to methane.
Yes, of course. Yeah, very small.
But still, one of the things that we're looking at is the use of hydroxyl to remove methane and other greenhouse gases. And so injecting hydroxyls with a hydroxyl generator into the air of a refrigeration factory to stop it leaking fluorine-based chemicals into the air would be a significantly effective carbon offset. So that's one project that I'm eager to pursue.
I think this brings us back to the white paper. There's an awful lot of education needed among the environmentalists in particular. They just don't understand really what's going on, and they are very happy just to follow this puritanical view that we need to cut our emissions because it's good for our souls, and hopefully Mother Nature will listen to our penance and turn things around to and save the planet, basically. It's complete and utter nonsense, but that can be spelled out in a paper. And I wouldn't give up on some politicians realizing this is going on, because they know that there's a very strong environment lobby that's overplaying its hand, and that if we can show them that this climate lobby is not being rational, for example, they're not being rational about emissions reduction because you can achieve the same effect by removing CO2. You've got a wedge in there, a wedge of showing that the climate lobby are not sensible. Their approach is not sensible.
But still, John, it remains the case that getting to politicians requires some sense of a public momentum around the direction that we're suggesting. And I don't think that we've got any momentum until these sorts of conversations start to happen in the media. And the problem is that the claim that emission reduction rests upon a religious psychology is something that you only hear from the denialist side of the argument. And so that argument is closely associated with climate denial. And so there's quite a challenge. So once you start talking about, these words like sacrifice and expiation and atonement that you've sort of hinted at as the sort of psychological motivation for the strategic vision, then that needs to be that's quite a complicated argument to set, framing it in the context that climate change is the most important challenge, and that's agreed, but that the proposed strategy won't work. It's that old Mencken idea of, to every problem there's a solution that's simple and obvious and wrong. That's where we're sitting with climate change.
Well, it's a question of, if we want to know if there's general agreement on what should be done, in terms of, say, CO2 removal plus geoengineering as opposed to emissions reduction, if that message hasn't got through yet. I mean, it still needs to be got through, but people still are harping on the emissions reduction as the only way out. They don't even think that there's anything else. And it even applies to kind of holy figures like Greta Thunberg, when, for a long time, I think she's mentioning CO2 removal now, but for a long time it was the world of adults is evil and selfish, and of course it is, and it's not doing anything about taking CO2 out of, about reducing CO2 emissions. So everything she talked about was reducing CO2 emissions, because that's what she'd learned was the problem. And she's not alone. I mean, there's lots and lots of people, most people who care about climate change, are saying, well, we have to reduce our emissions of CO2 in all these ways. But there aren't enough people around saying, no, that's not enough. That's just going to mean that we roast to death more slowly, but we still roast to death. And there needs to be a transition from ignoring climate change to saying, yes, we've got to do something about it, reduce emissions. And that transition is being made. But the second transition, which is from saying we've got to take CO2 out of the atmosphere to take us back to something livable, that hasn't been made. And it's just being made now, and more people are talking about it. But it's still not the generally accepted route. So we've still got a way to go before there's agreement amongst climate change people as to what's needed. We're not there yet.
It's very far from accepted. It's really posed with quite a lot of virulence. So Greta Thunberg spoke at Davos last year and said, we don't need net zero, we need real zero. And of course, the concept of real zero means a complete end to all combustion. And so the idea that we can end combustion is absurd. And yet that was what Greta was essentially advocating. So yeah, you're quite right, Peter. Now, where are we? Is somebody talking in the background?
Oh, sorry, it's my wife's come downstairs.
So now I'm quite interested to hear from Ronal, if you have any thoughts, and also Andrew, if either of you have any thoughts on this conversation. Well, Stephen?
I think we have to reckon that.
Your microphone's not working, Stephen.
Can you hear me now?
It's still extremely distorted. Andrew, did you want to speak?
Yes, I was just unmuting there, Robert. Thank you. Yeah, this whole conversation from the moment I came on to the present moment is really great. And the only problem I have with it, it's so broad that it goes to so many different places. And so I'm going to send you an email in the morning because I have an idea to somehow you notice I don't say much and I listen a lot. I've been on the ACA call for 3 years and I've spoken twice or 3 times the whole time. So I'm a listener and an integrator. So I'm educating myself because we have to educate others. So everything from getting to politicians to getting articles in magazines like The Atlantic, and I think we have this massive educational mission. And this particular group of people that I'm witnessing right here has probably more information, more relevant, pertinent information on our subject than any other gathering that I'm aware of, certainly on this planet. And so how do we integrate that? How do we distill that? How do we put that into an easy to, we're not members of a terribly intelligent species. So we're very much more run by our emotions than we are by our intellect. Giving someone a beautiful, scientifically accurate white paper will work 1 in 1,000 times, unfortunately. It'll work for us and we need that. But in terms of getting the tide turned, the tide of public opinion, the political tide, and the tide is turning and has turned, and so much has unfolded just in this last little while. I mean, we have just emerged from the Trump era, or we are in the process of emerging from the Trump era. So there's an awful lot that is very positive, very encouraging, and I have some ideas that I will be sharing as time goes on. That's about all I can it's about all I'm coherent enough to even say right now.
Yeah, look, I think getting these things into a simple popular story is the key issue. And that part of the trouble with the academic community is that the bar of peer review is so complex that getting the simple big story into that environment is very difficult. They're just restricted to technical analysis rather than I mean, maybe there are journals that pick up on the sort of strategic analysis that we've been discussing, but yeah, just finding where and how to publish it. Like I think the popular media is a better target than academic journals or politicians.
It's a public relations issue, obviously. And if we have the word public in there, it means the public has to actually be able to understand what we're talking about. So the academic world works well within itself, but to get it out of academia to the public in a coherent and effective way, I think that's our challenge. And I have some ideas on that front.
Right. Now, Stephen, have you managed to fix your microphone?
Does it sound okay to you now?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's fixed.
Unplugging it, replugging it seems to help. I've more or less given up trying to persuade political people, and all I'm doing is hammering away at the design of spray vessels and hoping that one day people will think that they need them after all. And I'm trying to get as much of the design work really complete and right, and keeping my head down.
I'd certainly be interested now if others are interested in hearing just a bit more about where you're at with the MCB design work.
All right. Well, I'll try and explain that the present design of vessels uses hydrofoils rather than trimarans, and instead of dragging a propeller through the water, which we used to with the first idea, we found that the drag of the turbines was very high, and so we instead of that we're using variable pitch hydrofoils which flap up and down and do work at right angles to the direction of travel of the boat. Not exactly right angles, but nearly at right angles, and this means that the work that you're doing is not slowing you down. And I can send people drawings of this. The hull itself has got a number of sockets in, into which you put in the equipment for generating energy and smoothing energy and filtering seawater and communications and bilge pumps and all that sort of stuff. And these are the contents of the socket can be rotated 45 degrees and pulled out, and another canister can put in to replace them. So it's the same philosophy as the backplane of the computers we had in the 1960s, where a maintenance engineer didn't have to worry about one particular chip. He just ripped the whole board out and put an identical replacement board in. So we've got an arrangement like that. The vessels displace 90 tons, and the power is about 300 kilowatts. There's about 250 kilowatts you need to make the spray. The rest of it is communications and controls and bilge pumps and radars and lights and things like that. And if you want to get a cost estimate, you need to find a number of ships that are made in similar numbers, and not many ships are, but an exception is the flower cloth corvettes that we built in 1940 in a great hurry, and they had a displacement of about 2,000 tons, and maybe it's 1,000, sorry, and it had about 2 megawatts of power, and they had 85 crew and weapon systems, and they cost £60,000 each in 1940, when a PhD was paid £600 a year. And you could index link that up now to get a cost of the vessels of about £3 million, $4 million, if you like. And we can, if you believe in the Toomey effect, which I do, not everybody does, you'd need about 300 of them in the right place at the right time to offset the thermal damage since pre-industrial times. You couldn't get all of them in the right place at the right time or working properly, so you might need to get 500 or 600 of them to put things back in the bag, and that would cost about the same as the climate conferences. If you borrowed the money to build these ships and had to pay the bankers interest and maintenance, it comes out at an annual cost less than the top class footballers and less than a climate conference. So it looks as if we could afford it quite easily. And we can choose where and when we do the cooling. So, for example, if we want to cool the Arctic, we could do that for about 2 months either side of the summer solstice, and then we could take them away and use them for preventing hurricanes in the Gulf of Mexico. We could move them over to the Barrier Reef, and we can afford enough of them to reduce the sea level rise. The sea level is partly ice melting, glaciers melting, but the main thing is the temperature of the deep oceans. And we could do that over about 20 years. And the real magic about it is that the energy that you reflect from a brighter cloud drop, you want to work that out, you work out how much energy the cloud drop is going to reflect, and compare that with the surface tension energy of the seed, the condensation nucleus on which that cloud drop grew. And that is many tens of millions, that ratio. So you can make your initial spray droplet, which is 0.8 of a micron, and then there's this enormous leverage up. And there's no other energy mechanism that I know of that has this enormous gain except for explosions with detonators. The detonator is a tiny thing and you get a very big explosion. So that's what they are. That's why they work so nicely. Being able to choose where and when you do this allows you to link up with the phase of the monsoons. Particularly the temperature gradient across an ocean is what affects the rainfall on either side. The Indian Ocean dipole is the temperature swing between east and west of the Indian Ocean. And that's what sets bushfires in Australia or floods in Kenya. And if you can get the Africans and the Australians to agree on what's a happy medium, you could get both of them having a reasonable compromise. So the short life is a very big attraction. Being able to choose where and when you do or stop is nice. I can send papers to the newcomers. I've got your new people to explain how we're going to do it and the effects. The big thing that we would like to do might be possible with climate modelers, which is to get an everywhere to everywhere transfer function of what happens with it. And we might be able to do this by changing the way the models are driven, by increasing or reducing in random sequences what you're spraying up and down with the different random sequences for each different ocean region. And then you correlate these random patterns with the observations that you get around the world. And this allows you to find out that if you spray in A and B and C places, you'll get these effects and rainfall and temperature in these other places. And this has been tried and it worked quite well with one PhD, but I can't get any replication on it. So that would be nice if we could manage that. Is that a useful introduction to marine cloud brightening?
Thank you very much, Stephen. I just ask if anybody has any comments in response to Stephen's
It does work particularly well in the Arctic. There's work being done in Norway by Camilla Stern, which shows that it cools everywhere fairly evenly, but the really big effect is up in the north, in the Arctic.
And what's your view in terms of Arctic cooling on the balance between cooling water that flows into the Arctic versus cooling the water once it's in the Arctic region?
Right. Well, the ice is, as it were, clamping the temperature at the melting point of ice. Right. So measuring the rate of ice loss is a very good way of measuring all the heat inputs to the ice. Maybe you won't get quite all of them, but it looks as if that's a very good way. Maybe you should multiply it by 1.5 to account for the other ones. The hot water flowing in, there's a lot flowing in up the North Atlantic drift, and this actually turns around and goes back again when it gets to Iceland. Only about 10 or 20% of it keeps on going up further north than that. There are numbers that I've got about the flow rates and the temperatures, but I think that a good part of that can be accounted for by just measuring the ice loss. Maybe it's double that. And this allows you to work out how many boats you'd need to cool just in the time available to reflect the sunshine. It's, I think, desirable that you shouldn't do it beyond probably late August, but you've got June and July where you've got more solar input coming in than into the equator, believe it or not, because it's coming in over 24 hours. You've got a much lower boundary layer so that you don't have to treat such a big depth of air. And you've got a high cloud fraction. So it's about the best place in the world to do marine cloud brightening, but for a short time. And fortunately, the boats can move very quickly when they're not spraying. You can get them from the Arctic down to the equator in a couple of weeks. And so we've got the flexibility of where and when we do it. If you look at the similar maps for stratospheric sulfur, it cools the whole world, but it doesn't cool the Arctic as much as it cools in other places. So the reason I think for that is that it's stopping long wave radiation going out in the winter. The aerosol from stratospheric sulfur doesn't know up from down, and it's good from stopping solar energy coming in, but it's also stopping long wave radiation going out in the middle of winter. So that's why the diagrams where they actually draw it as far up as the North Pole are showing that it's less effective for cooling than it is in other places.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Now, can I go back to John Nissen, unless anybody else wants to say something immediately? John?
Yeah. The latest modelling from Doug McMartin and colleagues is that if you inject the SO2 into the stratosphere north of 60 degrees north, it has a much shorter lifetime. So a few months rather than a year or more. So you can inject it in the late spring and early summer, and it'll have a cooling effect, and you don't have to worry about the IR infrared effect.
Once you put it up, it is stuck there for months. With marine cloud brightening, you can stop it as soon as the next time it rains. So you have to get exactly the right dose and be sure and confident you have got it right. Otherwise, you'll get something that you didn't expect, and then you can't get. It's like
well, we just want to get a significant net cooling, and that's what their modelling says can be achieved.
All right. and then you get dreadful blizzards somewhere because of that, all that extra cold air has come down, and you're stuck with them until your 6 months is over. It's like locking the.
Anyhow, I'm not arguing against marine cloud brightening. I'd say we should be trying to do both. I'm not arguing against marine cloud brightening. I'm just saying that SO2 in the stratosphere seems to be benign and effective.
But in any case, with these issues, there has to be field trials, and so like speculating about what the effects might be, like it's possible to do field trials on a gradual basis, where some of these questions about what the effect of full deployment would be can have information provided on a limited basis. And that's why it's so important to proceed with some of the limited scientific trials that have been proposed to just show what the system response will be.
And yeah, the important thing is that we actually do need this cooling desperately. And I've been rather negligent of the effects that we're already having from global warming, and I've been watching a series on Sundays from a black man who's in a wheelchair, but that doesn't stop him doing almost anything around the world, talking to people and looking at their occupations and seeing how their occupations and livelihoods are being gradually ruined by climate change and sea level rise. And this is that really is emotionally touching. I mean, one feels just how awful it is for these people. They have completely no future if things carry on and get worse. They're bad enough already, but Bangladesh is disintegrating. In 10 years, people of huge areas of Bangladesh are no longer livable, or the amount of land in one area has shrunk by 90% in 10 years over vast areas. I mean, they're trying to do things like planting mangroves, but it's so desperate that people are committing suicide, and this is now, and here is IPCC saying, well, we'll do something which we hope we can stop climate change by the turn of the century. I mean, then they're not just recognizing the devastation that global warming is already causing, and it's getting worse. The only way of dealing it quickly enough is through solar radiation management. And we ought to be pulling out all the stops. Marine cloud brightenings, stratospheric aerosol, the lot.
Now, I'd like to wind up the call in 5 minutes' time. So I'd just like to go around the room and just give everybody a chance to make a final comment. So any volunteers on that?
I'd just like to ask Stephen his views on microbubbling in the oceans as an alternative to marine cloud brightening. Have you looked at that, Stephen?
I don't know enough chemistry about that. I know that you want to use ferric chloride, and I have found that it seems to be an extremely good etch for almost everything. And that means we've got to be very careful about the equipment we use for making spray. We won't be able to use stainless steel or aluminium. One thing that we might be able to use.
Stephen, no, we're talking about microbubbles.
Russell Science's work. Yes.
I thought it was ferric chloride.
No.
I think that the micro bubbles that Russell Seitz make are excellent, and I'd like to see that happening. And I promised him a compartment, a canister, which I can put equipment in. And the way I think we might be able to help here is to have 2 spray vessels with a hose, a streamlined hose between them, so that we can get the bubbles injected over a very wide band. I think putting bubbles out from just one ship is going to leave you with a rather narrow track. And I'd like to have something a bit like the paravane that they used in minesweepers to widen the track we make. I don't know enough about the things that he's got for extending the life. I can believe that there are lots of things you could do. And it has another advantage that we can't work so well under clear skies, but he will be able to do better under clear skies. So in a way we're complementary. We might even be able to do 2 things from the same boats. The question is how much weight you need to have to make whatever additive you want for the longer life. I'm quite happy about making the bubbles.
It's the life of the bubbles that's important too, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it'd be interesting to bring Russell Seitz back on one of these calls and have that discussion together. But, we'll see what we can do.
Robert, we did have him on one of the calls.
Yes,
we did.
We've got that recorded.
I can't remember whether we came to any conclusion about how effective it would be. I think we were talking about the Greenland ice sheet at the time.
Yes.
And he was arguing that the things that float on the micro beads that Leslie Field proposes would all get blown to one side with the wind, or they get covered in.
Real.
They would go green rather quickly with growth. So they'd lose their effectiveness rather quickly.
All right.
He argued very strongly against that.
He did. Now, I've been keeping the recordings of all of these and have them on YouTube. So I've been a bit remiss in just sharing all of the links and working out, because some of the conversations that we've had have people haven't been wanting them to be public, and so we've just been keeping the links to people who've attended and close friends. But I mean, my preference is for these sorts of discussions to be entirely public. So does anybody have any objection if I publish this discussion as public, or would Stephen, you're happy with that?
I think I could have phrased various things better. I would have wanted to have put in a mention of both Toomey and John Latham, who have done the original work on this, and I think that I would like to have their names mentioned.
Yeah, thank you. All right. Well, anyway, I'll send a link including to a couple of older discussions, and let's wind up at that point. And thank you very much for a very stimulating conversation. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, just before we go, I would like to get involved with Herb on his contacts, but I think Doug and I are already going to do that. And also I need to renew my enthusiasm for some ideas with Andrew that we discussed, I think, probably a fortnight ago now. And so apparently there's an important person who lives in Bristol or somewhere quite close to me, which I need to.
In Bath.
In Bath, actually in Bath.
I know that. Yeah.
And Andrew,
So-
are you traveling to California?
Oh, thanks for the question. COVID permitting is what I've been saying, but we are planning to be in California from about the 10th, 11th or 12th of May
Mhm.
and doing a circuit and coming to get together in person, if that makes sense. And I just don't know what's going on. Just it seemed like there was a real confidence and then an overconfidence. Now it looks like COVID is spiking again in the States. And I don't know. We're literally saying, are we going to actually take a physical journey? Because we can do Zoom calls up the kazoo, as they say. So,
I
yeah.
personally will not be quite out of my vaccine waiting period by then.
Oh, I got the Johnson & Johnson, by the way, on the 9th. And now I'm waiting to see if I'm a woman of a certain age, which I don't seem to be. So I haven't had any bad effect, zero effects. My wife's had zero effects so far. And they say another 10 days or 2 weeks we'll be out of the woods. So we'll let you know.
I'm hoping for 3 more weeks